Picture a family dinner table. There are 4 people seated around it, 2 parents and 2 children, one older, one younger. The older child is explaining something. They are doing this with the quiet authority of someone who has spent years being the person in the room who already knows things, who has been the designated explainer, the one the parents turned to when they needed the younger one occupied, the one who learned to read a room because nobody else their age was in it. The younger child is listening with one ear and doing something else with the other, because they have spent their entire life having things explained to them by someone who wasn't a teacher and didn't have to be obeyed, and they have developed a finely tuned ability to extract what's relevant from a stream of information while simultaneously running a separate mental process. They are also, quietly, planning something. They have always been planning something. When you grow up in a world where the rules were made before you arrived and the positions of power were occupied before you could compete for them, you learn to find angles. Neither of these children is aware, in this moment, that the family they were born into has been quietly shaping them in ways that have nothing to do with what their parents consciously intended. The birth order, that simple, seemingly arbitrary fact of who arrived first, has been running in the background of their development like an operating system nobody installed on purpose, influencing their personalities, their cognitive styles, their social strategies, their risk tolerance, and their relationship with authority in ways that researchers have been trying to characterize, quantify, and debate for over a century. Birth order research is one of the more contentious areas of developmental psychology, partially because the effect sizes are genuinely contested, and partially because people find it deeply uncomfortable to suggest that something as arbitrary as when you were born within your family might have shaped who you became. But the evidence, when examined carefully and honestly, points to real patterns. Not deterministic, not universal, but consistent enough across multiple lines of research to be worth taking seriously. And the advantages are real on all sides. The firstborn, the middle child, the youngest, and the only child each occupy a position with its own hidden benefits that are easy to overlook when you are focused on the disadvantages. Understanding all 4 positions and the mechanisms that produce their characteristic effects reveals something fundamental about how family environments shape human development in ways that formal education and parenting philosophy rarely address. Begin with the mechanism, because the birth order effects that show up in research don't arise from magic or astrology. They arise from the straightforward fact that each child in a family grows up in a meaningfully different family environment, even when the family, the parents, and the house are all the same. The firstborn child enters a world of adults. For however long they are the only child, whether that is 1 year or 5, they are surrounded exclusively by people who are older, more verbally sophisticated, more cognitively developed, and more experienced. Every conversation they have is with an adult. Every interaction they receive is calibrated to an adult's understanding of what a child needs, which tends toward explanation, verbal engagement, and the kind of earnest, attentive interaction that adults give to children when they are not distracted by other children. Firstborns are also the recipients of parental investment at its most undiluted. First-time parents are anxious, attentive, and intensely focused on the singular project of this one child. Research on parental interaction styles consistently finds that firstborns receive more verbal interaction, more reading aloud, more direct teaching interaction, and more sustained one-on-one parental attention than later-born children. This is not because parents love later children less, it is because later children share that attention with the other children who exist by then. The second-born enters a world that already contains a sibling. From the beginning of their conscious experience, they have a peer, someone older and more capable than them, yes, but vastly closer to their own level than any adult, who occupies the household, and must be negotiated with. They have to share attention from the outset. They have to distinguish themselves in a family system that already has an established member, and they have to deal with someone who has been there longer, and who, at least initially, knows more. This divergence in initial environment is the engine driving most of what birth order research finds. The different positions create different adaptive pressures, and the children in those positions develop different skills and tendencies in response to those pressures. The advantages of each position are the flip side of the challenges it poses. Abilities developed precisely because that position required them. The firstborn's most consistently documented advantage is intellectual, and the mechanism behind it is one of the more elegant findings in the field. The confluence model, proposed by psychologists in the 1970s and subsequently refined and debated, suggests that the intellectual environment of a family is influenced by the average intellectual level of everyone in it. When a firstborn child is born, the family's intellectual environment is entirely adult, and adults, whatever their educational level, operate at a cognitively demanding level compared to any child. As subsequent children are born, they dilute this intellectual environment. They add members who are operating at lower cognitive levels, reducing the average sophistication of the household's intellectual atmosphere. This means firstborns spend their formative years in a more cognitively stimulating environment than their younger siblings, simply by virtue of being surrounded by adults during a period when no other children exist in the household. The IQ advantage of firstborns, small in absolute terms, typically 1 to 3 points, but consistent across large samples, is proposed to arise from this environmental difference rather than from any genetic advantage. But the confluence model contains a second component that is perhaps more interesting than the environmental stimulation effect, the teaching effect. Firstborns, when siblings arrive, become teachers. They explain things to younger siblings, they demonstrate, they answer questions. And the cognitive research on teaching is clear. Explaining a concept to someone else is among the most effective methods for consolidating and deepening one's own understanding of that concept. The firstborn who explains how to tie shoes, how to read, how math works, or how the rules of a game operate is simultaneously rehearsing and reinforcing their own mastery of those things. This teaching role produces what might be the firstborn's most significant hidden advantage: verbal fluency and the ability to explain complex things clearly. Firstborns in large samples score consistently higher on verbal tests than their younger siblings. They are overrepresented in academic and professional contexts that reward verbal reasoning, explanation, and communication. They are, by a consistent margin, overrepresented among people in leadership and instructional roles, not because of some innate quality they were born with, but because the family environment placed them in a teaching role that exercised exactly the capabilities those roles require. The firstborn's advantage in leadership is one of the most replicated findings in birth order research. Multiple studies of different populations have found firstborns overrepresented among heads of state, CEOs, military officers, and organizational leaders. The explanation most consistent with the available evidence is not dominance or aggression. It is the early experience of being responsible for others, of having authority within a small social system, and of learning to manage the practical and interpersonal challenges that responsibility creates. The hidden advantages of middle children are less obvious than those of firstborns and require understanding the particular adaptive challenges of the middle position. Middle children occupy, structurally, the most socially complex position in a family. They are not the oldest. They do not have the automatic authority that comes with arrival order. They are not the youngest. They do not have the novelty advantage that the new arrival brings. They are, by definition, positioned between competing interests, competing claims on attention, and competing sources of family power. And the adaptation they develop in response to this position is, across multiple lines of research, the most socially sophisticated of any birth position. Middle children consistently score higher on measures of social agreeableness, diplomatic skill, and the ability to navigate conflicting interests than their firstborn or lastborn siblings. They are more likely to seek compromise in negotiation situations. They are more likely to be described by peers as fair, as good at resolving conflicts, and as effective in group settings where different parties need to be managed simultaneously. The mechanism is straightforward. The middle child practices these skills constantly throughout development. They cannot overpower the firstborn, who is older, larger, and more experienced for most of childhood. They cannot simply use the novelty and charm offensive that the youngest sibling deploys. They have to find a third way, which typically involves understanding what different people want, finding common ground, and presenting themselves as reasonable and accommodating while still advancing their own interests. By the way, if you want to go even deeper into the secret lives of ancient humans, I just launched a full course called The Secret Lives of Ancient Humans. 10 modules, 3+ hours of content covering everything we never talk about on YouTube. What they feared, how they communicated, what hunted them, and much more. Plus an exclusive PDF guide included. Link in the description. See you inside. This is the skill set of diplomacy. It is the skill set of effective management and negotiation. And middle children develop it not through training or conscious effort, but through the daily pressure of existing in a position that requires it. The research on middle children and negotiation shows this in measurable form. In experimental negotiation tasks, middles consistently achieve better outcomes for all parties, themselves and their negotiating partners, than firstborns who tend toward more competitive strategies, or lastborns who tend toward more charm-based approaches. approaches. They are, in laboratory conditions, the most effective negotiators of the birth order positions. The hidden advantage of the middle position is that it produced, through decades of practice in the most natural social laboratory available, the skill of making everyone feel adequately considered. Middle children are also, across multiple studies, the most likely to maintain close friendships outside the family. The argument for why this happens is that middles, having learned early that the family's attention and resources were contested, invested more heavily in building social networks outside the family as alternative sources of support, validation, and belonging. This peer orientation, stronger than that of firstborns or lastborns, produces social networks that are, in adulthood, broader and more diverse than those of other birth positions. Middle children enter adult life with more practiced skills at building and maintaining relationships with non-family members, and their friendship networks reflect this. The youngest child's position in the family is the one most surrounded by popular mythology: the spoiled baby, the charming manipulator, the one who got away with everything. And like most popular mythology, it contains enough truth to persist while missing much of what is actually interesting. The lastborn's genuine hidden advantage is in social performance and creativity, and the mechanism connecting them to their birth position is one of the more elegant in the field. Younger siblings, arriving into a family where the older children have already established identities, roles, and areas of competence, face a particular developmental challenge. The available niches are occupied. The firstborn is already the responsible one, the academic achiever, the one who does things the proper way. A younger sibling who competes directly in this domain will, for most of childhood, lose. The older child has a head start measured in years. The rational adaptive response to this structural situation is differentiation, finding a niche that is not already occupied, developing competencies that are not already claimed. This differentiation pressure consistently pushes younger siblings towards the unconventional, the creative, and the socially performative. Lastborns are overrepresented among artists, entertainers, comedians, and people in creative professions. They are more likely to take up unusual hobbies, pursue unconventional careers, and challenge established rules and conventions. The research suggests this is not a personality trait they were born with. It is an adaptive strategy developed in response to a family environment that already had its conventional niches filled. The evolutionary biologist Frank Sulloway, who has written the most comprehensive analysis of birth order and personality, argues that firstborns are naturally conservative, invested in maintaining the status quo that gave them their privileged position, while laterborns are naturally radical, inclined to challenge existing structures because those structures did not serve them as well as they served the firstborn. Sulloway documented in an extensive historical analysis that laterborn scientists were significantly more likely to support revolutionary scientific theories: heliocentrism, evolution, continental drift, early in their careers than firstborn scientists, who tended toward initial skepticism and later adoption. This is a provocative finding, and one that has been both supported and contested in subsequent research. But the core of the argument, that birth position creates different relationships with established authority and conventional thinking, has considerable empirical support across different domains. The lastborn's social advantage is also the most immediately visible in everyday life. Youngest children are, by the time they are developing social skills, surrounded by multiple older people whose attention they need to secure without the authority of the oldest or the novelty of a new arrival. The adaptation is charm, the development of social performance skills, humor, storytelling, and the kind of warm relational approach that draws people in without relying on status or seniority. Lastborns are consistently rated by peers as more charming, more fun, and more socially engaging than their older siblings. This is a real skill with real advantages in adult life. Careers in sales, entertainment, leadership, and any domain requiring the ability to connect with diverse audiences reward exactly the social performance skills that the youngest child's position required them to develop. The only child occupies a position that shares some characteristics with firstborns: adult-only environment, undiluted parental attention, teaching effect absent because there are no siblings to teach, but differs in important ways that produce a distinct profile. Only children do not experience the dethroning that firstborns experience when a sibling arrives. The resource dilution that affects all other birth positions, the sharing of parental time, attention, and investment, does not occur. An only child's relationship with their parents is sustained as the primary relationship of their childhood without competition from siblings. The research on only children has historically been colored by a negative stereotype. The spoiled, socially awkward loner that has been consistently undermined by empirical investigation. Only children in large-scale studies show outcomes comparable to or better than firstborns on academic achievement, verbal ability, and leadership potential, and comparable to or better than lastborns on social confidence and relationship with peers. The genuine advantage of the only child position is the sustained depth of parental investment and the particularly intense relationship with adult intellectual culture that results. Only children spend their entire childhood in a household of adults without the leveling effect of sibling peer culture within the home. They tend to be more comfortable with adults, more verbally sophisticated in adult-style interaction, and more oriented toward adult-type activities and interests from an earlier age. Only children also show higher levels of self-reliance. Not from neglect, but from the specific texture of their family environment, in which they do not have siblings to turn to for companionship and must develop comfort with their own company and their own internal resources. This produces, in many only children, a stronger capacity for sustained independent work and a higher tolerance for solitude than is typical of children with siblings, traits with significant advantages in many adult professional contexts. The research on birth order is not without its critics, and engaging with the criticisms honestly is necessary for understanding what the evidence actually supports. The most significant methodological challenge is that most birth order research has historically compared different people from different families, comparing firstborns from one family to secondborns from another, rather than comparing siblings within the same family. When researchers use within-family designs, comparing the personalities and outcomes of siblings raised in the same household, the birth order effects that show up in between-family comparisons often shrink substantially and sometimes disappear. This is an important finding. It suggests that some of what looks like a birth order effect in large population samples is actually a family size effect, or a socioeconomic effect. Firstborns disproportionately come from smaller families and from families with more resources, and these factors independently predict academic and professional outcomes. When you control for family size and socioeconomic variables within the same family, the birth order effect becomes smaller. Smaller, however, does not mean absent. The most rigorous recent research, large-scale studies using within-family designs with adequate statistical power, continues to find birth order effects on some outcomes, particularly on personality traits including openness to experience and agreeableness, and on intellectual measures. The effects are smaller than the popular literature on birth order typically claims, but they are real. The important caveat is that birth order effects are tendencies across large populations, not destinies for individuals. The firstborn advantage in verbal ability does not mean every firstborn is more verbally capable than every laterborn. It means that in a large sample, the average difference favors firstborns. Individual variation in genetics, in specific family circumstances, in random developmental factors, and in the many other influences on development is far larger than birth order effects. Birth order is one input among many, not a determining factor. Back at the dinner table, the older sibling has finished explaining and the younger one has finished listening. Neither of them knows that the particular texture of their exchange, the authority on one side, the selective attention on the other, the negotiation implicit in the dynamic between them, has been running as a developmental influence for as long as they have both been in the household. The firstborn learned to explain things clearly because there was always someone younger who needed things explained. The secondborn learned to extract the relevant from a stream of information while processing something else entirely because this is what life in a household with an older sibling produced as an adaptive strategy. The advantages are real. They are not gifts. They are skills developed in response to structural pressures, capabilities grown from the specific challenges of each position. The firstborn's verbal fluency and leadership orientation, the middle child's diplomatic intelligence and investment in outside social networks, the youngest child's creative differentiation and social performance skill, the only child's comfort with adult interaction and independent work. None of these positions is straightforwardly better than the others. None produces a predetermined outcome, but all of them have shaped, in ways that most people walking around in those positions have never consciously examined, the particular capabilities and tendencies that they carry through the rest of their lives. The dinner table is clearing, the conversation is ending. The invisible developmental process continues,